Welcome to the Forum on Poverty and Pandemic. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. The COVID-19 pandemic has become an unprecedented global crisis that's likely to have a tremendous impact on the progress toward the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It has already exposed the most vulnerable group. It has already also reversed decades of progress in poverty reduction worldwide. So in our event today, we are going to do some reality check together and try to find solutions. This forum is hosted by CGTN think tank and co-hosted by the Carter Center, the Schiller Institute, the Bridge Tank, China-EU South African Institute of International Affairs, the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute, and the Russian-Chinese Analytical Center. Before we go to our panelists, both here in the studio and online with us, take a look at this first.
Decades of progress in reducing extreme poverty are in danger of slipping away. The COVID-19 pandemic is the reason. According to the World Bank, the world could see its first increase in extreme poverty in 22 years. Up to 100 million people globally could fall back into extreme poverty in 2020. In Morocco, the number of poor people is expected to increase by about 1 million. In Iraq, an additional 4.5 million risk falling below the poverty line. The spread of COVID-19 disturbed demand and supply, slowed the circulation of goods and services, and halted the flow of people and capital. For the world's poor, livelihoods are being destroyed at an unprecedented rate. Communities could be pushed beyond the brink. But it's more than that. A COVID generation is emerging who, without internet access, are missing out on schooling. 30 million children may never return to school after this, losing their main escape from poverty. At least 25 countries also face acute food insecurity because of the pandemic. It's now even more difficult to reach the goal of ending extreme poverty globally by 2030. It's high time we recognize the scale of the crisis and seek joint efforts.
And I'm glad to be joined by a very strong panel here in the studio with us and also online from different parts of the world. May I have the honor to introduce Mr. Li Xiaoyun, who's the lead chair professor at the China Agricultural University. Leslie Mastorp, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at the New Development Bank. Mr. Zheng Xinlie, Dean of the School of Applied Economics at Renmin University of China. Joining us online, we have three of them. Vilani Msambu, who is the Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. Joining us in the United States, Liu Yawei, Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center. Joining us from the UK, Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics. Meanwhile, we are also having our audience joining us here in the studio coming from different parts of the world. A very warm welcome to all of you. Gentlemen, let me start by asking one question, very simple one. Today, we are talking about the pandemic and its impact on poverty reduction worldwide. I know you have been dealing with this issue for decades. If you can, share with me a story or two to reflect how you are seeing the link between the two factors. Professor, may I start with you?
Yes, please. Yeah. In Yunnan, in the very remote area of Yunnan, Menla County, the village called Hebian village. 5 years ago, when I started my work there, it was very, very poor. After 5 years, the village has developed into a tourist spot, and the people spend their years and for the summer school and for the winter schools, summer camps, all different activities. And the farmers gain actual income of 10 to 15 to 20,000 RMB a year last year and before last year. But this year, the income was heavily affected by the pandemic. from January of this year until July of this year, and the major income source was completely cut off because the village was developed into a tourist village over the last 5 years. There was no actual cash income unless the villagers were waiting for income from agriculture. So that was the case. What I can see, and also another village where I worked in Enshi was a very similar situation, that last year we started to generate income by having a tourist again. And again, this year, first half this year was almost no income from that kind of income source. So that is exactly the case how we could see the impact of the pandemic on the poverty.
It's everywhere. In China, certainly you see that, even though China has somewhat successfully controlled and prevented further spread of COVID-19. That's an example coming from China. What about coming from you, Mr. Mastorp? You work for the New Development Bank, emerging economies, very different stories.
What we do, Tianwei, traditionally, we finance infrastructure. We build roads and dams and ports and power stations, etc. Because of the pandemic, we had to shift focus. We had to do a dramatic shift, and we had to do it very swiftly. So early part of this year, we put in place an emergency assistance program, and we needed to make sure that we direct our finance to reach the poorest of the poor. And it was not easy, because to design those interventions takes some careful thinking. So let's take the case of South Africa. We provided $1 billion loan to South Africa, and part of the financing went into social grants directly into the bank accounts of the poorest of the poor. So it was not sort of broadly defined programs run by various government departments. It was money that went directly into the beneficiaries' accounts. Similarly, here in China, our first loan after the pandemic started here was to 3 provinces, Guangdong, Hubei, and Henan. These were the 3 most affected provinces in China by the pandemic. So we provided 7 billion renminbi, and that went directly into provision of protective equipment, of masks, of ventilators, of additional hospital beds for critical care for the additional hospitals. So we had to make sure that we live up to our name as a development bank to respond to moments of crisis.
Professor Zheng, I know you have been just finishing your first phase analysis of poverty reduction in some of the provinces you've been working for over the past few years. But now, very complicated matter of the pandemic makes things very differently. Tell me more about your example.
I have a case study for the county, Henan, Xin County, who's the gate of the Henan province, nearby the Wuhan area. Your question is simple, but it's very difficult to answer. But I think SDG framework is useful to think about the solutions. There's 2 issues. One issue is that the major source of the local people's income source, 8% of their income source or labor income are from urban area. So when the pandemic arrived, then the effective and the natural response of the urban area is to shut down. So the people in the poor area, they don't have a job, they don't have pay. So that's a huge challenge for those people and for policymakers. Then the Chinese local governments figured out a way to control the pandemic and allow the people from poor area back to the city. So they solved this problem, control the pandemic and offering the jobs.
Let's hear stories from elsewhere as well. Mr. Msambu, you are based in South Africa. You already heard Mr. Mastorp coming from a more macro way of talking about what to do in the emerging economies. But I'm sure you have more on-the-site stories to share.
I think what's been quite interesting with regards COVID-19, particularly in the onset of COVID-19 and when the country went into a very strict lockdown. It was quite interesting how the different sectors became affected, as some of the formal sectors became reopened, one of the big factors that affected, for instance, a lot of people were the informal economy and the informal traders. And I think what the government realized at an early stage is that they could not reopen only the formal aspects of the economy at a time when your informal traders were also feeling the pinch from COVID-19. So I think that was quite an interesting dynamic within South Africa, and it showed that there does need to be attention when it comes to poverty reduction and poverty eradication measures, to really look at support mechanisms for the informal sector and try to actually bring their level of trade up. Some would say trying to formalize the informal economy.
Thank you for sharing some of the latest case studies and also your observations. In the United States, Mr. Liu Yawei, Mr. Liu, the U.S., of course, the biggest economy in the world, but also one of the economies hardest hit so far by COVID-19. What is the situation there? What are some of the case studies relating, poverty reduction in the country and the impact of the pandemic that you can share with us?
Well, we've been staying at home since early March. So what we see here is we see on TV the poverty in the U.S. We read about the poverty in the U.S. and we heard about the poverty in the U.S. I think some of the sources indicate there are 38 million Americans that are living under the UN criteria of poverty, about 38 million Americans, and about 40 million Americans lost their job since the pandemic. U.S. Congress did pass a relief effort. That one actually prevented more Americans from sliding into poverty. However, that money, $3 trillion, is running out, and Congress, I don't think, will be able to pass another relief effort. On TV, we see Americans, going to the food bank, long lines in the cars, waiting for hours. On one side, they try to get tested. On the other, they try to get food. I just read in New York Times today, 250 million people in the world are now facing the threat of hunger, starvation. That's shocking.
It is shocking. We thought, the word hunger can be so far away with us, but one global crisis is already at the door. So we're talking about real threats right now. Professor Begg, you're based in London. Things are different compared to the US, but still the European continent is also facing a huge threat of COVID-19 recently in France, for example. Now, tell me more about the case studies you have been looking into before coming to our event today.
The main point I'd try to make first is that we need to distinguish between poverty prevention, which some of the other speakers have been talking about, and poverty alleviation. The European approach has been very much poverty prevention because, as you know, most European countries have a very developed social protection system that kicks in automatically to provide support for those who lose jobs. But one particularly important feature of the European response to the pandemic associated with prevention has been the announcement of a wide range of schemes designed to keep people in employment. And what they do is to subsidize the retention of that person in the labor market. That means that the families that continue to get income, and that stops poverty expanding.
The examples coming from all over the world, just within quite a few minutes, we see whether it is developed economies, emerging economies, or developing ones, we are somewhat, quote unquote, in this boat together. And this is a global crisis. Now, let's try to figure out some of the logics that in your answers. If I could have all of you, well, our audience as the witness, to answer some questions for choices. First of all, you can say yes and you can say no. I'm going to read these questions, and you can raise the paper on your hand that has yes or no. And I can choose, after you post your answer, to you as to why you would give the answer that you preferred. Okay. So those case studies about tourism in poverty-stricken areas once was the promise, but now become very much lagging behind. About funding, helping those economies, whether it's likely to work. This is about the flow of population coming from rural to urban areas, whether they can come back again and solve the problem. Coming from South Africa, we see people are talking about informal industries, how to deal with it. Coming from the biggest economy in the world, the US, people are going into poverty as a result of not having jobs. And in Europe, is trying to prevent, but not necessarily at this time could be all-time efficient. So may I pose these questions to all of you? Emerging economies struggle with more severe poverty reduction problems in COVID-19 than developed economies? Yes or no? After you hear everybody's answer. Emerging economies tend to struggle more or not? 6 yes. Okay, we pass, gentlemen. We have a consensus. Another one, illness can drag people back into poverty. How much more difficult can it make for countries to alleviate poverty? Is it going to be really difficult? Is it going to be really difficult, or is it going to be just as difficult as the other thing? Meaning about the health issue. The health issue. Will health issue be a key issue in this regard? Yes or no? It depends. We don't have a depends sign. No. Okay. This is the only time we have 5 yes and 1 no. Yes and no. All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. It seems that we have already consensus as to what brought poverty during the pandemic era. And we know to a certain extent what are the key issues. Now let's try to solve them. Is money the solution, Mr. Masdorp?
Money is part of the solution. How the world has responded to date, as you know, central banks have all uniformly reduced benchmark interest rates, meaning they have pumped liquidity, pumped more money into most economies so that businesses can get working capital to pay their staff in order for livelihoods to be maintained. Secondly, governments, because of the lockdown...
So you're saying it's not just the money. It has to be concerted together to support with money.
That's on the monetary policy side. Then governments, on the other hand, because of the reduction in tax revenues, because of the lockdown, companies' revenues have ceased, which means that they are not paying the taxes to the government. So the governments have started to borrow more. So uniformly across the world now, most developing countries, developed countries, they're all borrowing more. So that's the money side. But there is no way that we can solve this problem with money alone. It's going to be ingenuity. We're going to have to look at the world through fresh lenses. Challenges, though, Tian, is that many countries were at a profound disadvantage at the start of the crisis. In other words, for example, at the end of 2019 already, we could see that economic growth was the lowest since 2008. And a number of countries have been downgraded. The economies are not growing. So the pandemic have worsened an already bad situation.
Kind of a double down effect in a way. Mr. Liu, tell me more about your thoughts. Is money the solution? You talk about the huge amount of cash the U.S. government pumped into the economy, particularly to every individual consumer. In the longer term, will that be sustainable? What is going to be the issue in terms of money?
No, I think in the U.S. it's a totally different situation. It's easier for U.S. to borrow money. And of course, the simplest way for U.S. to get money is just to print money. So in the case of U.S., it's not about money. It's the first and most important measure, that is to contain the spread of a virus. You know, U.S. now has the largest number of confirmed cases and the largest number of deaths related to COVID-19. So if people don't follow the rules, if people ignore advice from the scientists, if they don't wear masks, then life is not going to go back to normal, and people are not able to go back to work, and that will certainly worsen the situation. So here in the US, the situation is different from China, it's different from South Africa, it's different from UK. The key challenge here is to follow the rules and contain the virus first before you can do anything.
Set the priority right? First thing first. No matter how much money you have got over there, without prevention and control, you're going to still keep on pumping without the result. Now, Professor Beck, you are a professor of economics. You know better about the money issue than I do. Tell me more about your thoughts. Does money matter? To what degree?
Well, there's an old distinction that's sometimes made between a necessary and a sufficient condition. Yes, money is necessary, but it's not sufficient to deal with the problem in at least two respects. The first is that because of the extent of the lockdown, particularly in the richer countries, but probably also now coming in some emerging markets and maybe the poorer countries, the loss of income has to be spread amongst those who are active in society. In European countries, major winners from this lockdown have been the health sector and the online delivery sector. Landlords are being asked to pay some of the cost by not insisting on rent being paid. And this is about burden sharing. And then there's a further element to this, which is how things evolve next. Because one credible scenario for how the pandemic unfolds is that it leads to permanent structural changes in the economy. I'll give you one example in this. Employers in London are being encouraged to bring back their office workers, and office workers are resisting. And the result of this is that the local economy that services the office workers, the sandwich bars, the pubs, and so on, it's struggling very much. Is this a permanent change, or is it something that's purely temporary? I suspect that we're going to see some permanent changes, such as a reduction in air travel, maybe reduced tourism, alterations to supply chains, as you and I have discussed in the past, which we've not really taken into account in thinking only about money.
Besides the money issue, there are other social factors that you talked about. The three of you, gentlemen. Professor Lee, start with you. So what to do with those people in Yunnan? Have you talked to them since tourism has failed at this very start of the pandemic?
There's one farmer. During the lockdown, I asked the farmer through a WeChat, how are you doing your life? There was no cash income. And then the village leader told me, Professor Lee, no, we really miss you, because I've been working with them for 5 years, and we miss you, but we realized that we need also cope with crisis. We started to plant rice. And 2 years ago, because the labor conflict, they all stopped planting rice to shift their emphasis to a non-agricultural sector. Now they're back to agriculture. And some farmers start to collect the honey in the forestry. So the livelihood has been diversified. So this is the way how the small farmer, they are dealing with the crisis. And this really, really very good way, and this really enlightened me very much, which I personally hold very strongly that we need to develop a very high-income industry, which is tourist. But the crisis started to tell us a different story. That story means for the countries, you have a majority of small farmers. You need to consider different kind of system.
What you're saying is there's no one-size-fits-all solution in a way. And people are innovative themselves. They actually could figure out some solutions somewhat. We also have right now joining us Sergei Senikoev, who is the president of the Russian Chinese Analytical Center. Mr. Senikoev, I'm so glad we are finally connected. And I see a big smile on your face. Earlier, we were already talking about the challenges of COVID-19. being linked to a studio is one of those. But having said that, though, let me ask you also about your case study in Russia regarding the pandemic and the poverty.
I think that certainly we understand everybody that the world changed very much. World is absolutely another, which was before this 2020. And now we will think about new mechanisms of construction of new order. The most difficult situation is in employment. A lot of companies and a lot of organizations fired a lot of people, and employment now is very important thing what we are talking and thinking about. Also the education, a lot of pupil and students going on online education, and this is also changing the system, and it's a lot of problems with it.
Mr. Msambo, have you seen some innovative ideas, bottom up from the root to now to the overall system to try to figure out ways during the time of pandemic on the issue of poverty?
Well, I think you have seen, not only in South Africa, but also throughout the continent. I think there was a realization that Africa stood at the back of the line when it comes to the global supply chains. And we saw entrepreneurs, we saw universities and research institutions actually taking up the mantle and saying, we can produce some of these products locally. And I think what this is really speaking to is the issue of building resilience in local economies, but also in regional economies. So I think it's quite important in moving beyond, this pandemic to understand that it's not going to be the last pandemic. And therefore, we need to try and find innovative solutions to becoming more resilient. On the African perspective, that I think speaks to building also of regional value chains. And I think that's going to be quite important moving forward. And I think there's a number of initiatives such as your Belt and Road Initiative, there's your new BRICS Development Bank, and a whole range of other new development finance tools.
What does it take, Mr. Mastorp, to build resiliency?
I like your point about resilience, and you are spot on. It is absolutely essential to prepare and lay the foundations to be better prepared for the next crisis. There are a few things we've realized through this crisis. Number one, small and micro enterprises are at the heart of an economy. More than 80% of the jobs in most of our developing countries come from these small and medium-sized enterprises. And there are small things that governments can do and change in their behavior. There's this low-hanging fruit, things they can start doing today that can change the financial viability of some of those companies.
But the governments are saying, well, we are doing it. Are they doing enough?
Governments, when they procure goods and services from small businesses, they often pay after 60 days, in some cases 90 days. Governments today start to pay small businesses and micro businesses on time, right? And firstly settle all arrears. That can be a direct transfer to make a difference in the lives of those companies. But I agree fully that what's required is to build the capacity to prepare ourselves better for the next crisis.
So it seems that there are a lot of information you already shared. May I just pull some of the strings and try to collect together some questions in a way? It seems that we're discussing what about the so-called one-size-fits-all or prepared plan vis-a-vis innovative ideas in time of crisis. We're also talking about the role of the governments vis-a-vis the vitalities of the private sector or of the market, in a way, at a time of crisis. Maybe we can put all of these debates into these categories that would make our discussion more lively, in a way. So, Mr. Berg, Which one you want to pick up?
The role of the state. In many respects, we've had several decades of rolling back the state, saying the market must do everything. And what the pandemic has illustrated is the state has the vital role to play in a number of areas, in both responding immediately, in cushioning the negative effects of the pandemic, including financially, but also reinventing itself to find ways to take things forward. One example of this is the almost unlimited, at least in European terms, the almost unlimited resources being made available to healthcare systems. They say we need this, the government say yes, and they borrow to enable that to happen. But that can't go on forever. So there has to be rethinking of where the boundaries of the state are going to lie in the future. The state has helped with small business loans, as has been mentioned by a number of other speakers. The state has helped by giving the relief to individuals. But it has now to think, what is our strategy for exiting this pandemic? And that is where the combination of fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus has to be got just right to make it accord with what is affordable as well as what makes economic sense. The state has to think of the next step. How do we exit, having dealt with the necessity to cushion the impact?
State, market, Mr. Mastorp.
I think in addition, I would just want to add one more variable. I think what this pandemic has done is highlighted the importance of the digital economy and technology.
Yes.
It's no longer just a state versus market, but I think in some underdeveloped countries, because they have some of the digital foundations, the engines of the digital economy, kids could at least go to school by sitting at home. Many kids in many developing countries have lost months, probably the entire academic year. So I think it's very important to look at how do we enable this digital economy at a faster rate. And that is part of also building the resilience so that we can have a cushion in the event of lockdowns where large parts of the economy is closed down.
Is it a governance issue?
Absolutely agree with my African friends about this resilience building. And resilience building first requires we recognize that the society itself and the social networks, solidarity, values, and all those things. Now works. All those things worked. Obviously, not only for the prevention and stopping transmission of the virus, but also in the follow-up, the economic recovery process. So another reason why we should not only overemphasize the role of market, technology, state, but we need to understand the kind of interaction
and intertwined in a way.
Interaction that different actors come into a very positive and dynamic driving force.
Mr. Msambu, coming from South Africa, want to take what Professor Lee just said?
It's absolutely important. I think what he's saying around the issues of society, building solidarity within society. And I think those are the things that actually build resilience. If you have a cohesive society, you have also a society that is able to endure difficult times, but that is also able to, when times are good, to also think about the potential for bad times. So social cohesion is important. Social networks are important.
But there's one issue, I don't want to escape that, which our Russian guest touched on slightly, that is the governance issue. It is no secret that at a time when we are experiencing a crisis, there are multiple crises going on at the same time, and they are interacting and reinforcing one another. For example, geopolitics. For example, a lack of international cooperation, more call for some countries on unilateralism. How we can at least avoid the worst consequences of these tendencies, and at least we could focus our attention still on poverty reduction. May I invite Mr. Mastorp maybe to begin with?
In China right now, the pandemic has largely been taken care of. However, People cannot travel into China because you'll have to stay here for 14 days in quarantine. So there's a massive impact on tourism in China, right? Similarly, people inside China cannot travel abroad. Small islands, for example, that are dependent.
They could, but the airlines are very limited in
terms
of the numbers.
Exactly. So solving the pandemic in one country is not sufficient, and you have to look at how you can contribute to resolving this challenge on a more global level. It has just reinforced that idea, and there are many other challenges facing the world, which shows the importance of multilateral institutions.
Mr. Liu, though, I know you are for international cooperation. That's why you work for the Carter Center for decades. But there are countries that are having it difficult at this time to subscribe to that idea.
Another vulnerable institution during the pandemic is actually the poverty or lack of international cooperation on all fronts. So I think it's going to take time for leading countries and international organizations to work together. If you look at the case of WHO, I think it is quite vulnerable after U.S. has withdrawn from it. If you look at U.S.-China collaboration in 2014, 2015, when Ebola took place, and the EU is a big part of that containment. But this time, there is a lack of international cooperation where China and the US and the EU can work hand in hand to do a lot of things in Africa, other developing countries.
Mr. Senecovic, you want to add to that?
20 years ago, we all thought that market will solve any kind of problems. Now we understand it was a big mistake, that this is not right. So I think that the most good way is optimal conjunction of market and state like it is in China. Because if market is initiations, state is regulations. So both is important in this period of time, and we should make so good convergence of these two institutions.
Professor Begg, earlier people talk about China and the EU and the US. The UK now is not part of the EU anymore. But how do you see the issue of global cooperation sitting where you are?
Well, I think that we talked about market and state. I think there's a third word to add into this, which is institutions. Because the institutions of global governance have struggled over recent years. In 2008, 2009, under the leadership of George W. Bush and Gordon Brown, there was a major attempt to boost the role of the G20. And that, it may not solve everything, but it had a significant impact in dealing with the financial crisis of a decade ago. For once, the EU is in the lead. You may know that in July, the EU agreed on a comprehensive recovery package over and above those being initiated by member states of the Union. The value of it was 750 billion euros, which is about 4% of GDP. That is a huge stimulus going into the economy, and it's being done by the EU level borrowing for the first time directly from the markets, rather than having to get its money from the individual countries. So there is innovation going on institutionally. What we need is more of it. I would like to see the G20 revived, and I'd like to see the IMF given all the resources it's going to need if new demands come up as poorer countries are hit more than they have been up to now by the pandemic.
Our program today is trying to work on the issues that the UN has been working on over the decades. And certainly this is a time of great challenge and could be great opportunities in terms of our concerted efforts to work together. Before we go, I do want to have one takeaway from every one of you. We discussed a lot of issues. Professor Begg, one sentence, you are very good with it.
To me, the litmus test for international cooperation and dealing with the pandemic will be how we manage the vaccines once these vaccines are scientifically proven. We need to distribute them. We need them to not be nationalistic, and that is going to be a severe test of how well the global community comes together.
First thing first, and vaccine is the priority, of course. Thank you. Mr. Liu.
I echo what Professor just said, that each and every country, particularly the United States, China, and Russia, and other countries, need to reduce their vaccine nationalism and figure out a way how they're going to collaborate to come up with a vaccine that works, and also how to distribute the vaccine not only to their people, but also to the people all over the world, and particularly people in developing countries.
Mr. Munsambu, what will be yours?
I think builds solidarity. I hope it heralds a new era of solidarity within countries, but also globally, so that we use the crisis not to all turn inward, but that we use the crisis to actually herald a new era of global cooperation.
Thank you. Mr. Sendakoev?
Some very important topics in our agenda, our international agenda, which we should solve all together. And certainly the medical care and the questions like vaccines and viruses, it's a particular topic which we should make together with international cooperation.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Zheng?
The households, the firms, and the local governments to build their capacity ready to change. That's all.
Build a system of governance that involves everyone. Mr. Mastor.
I think as many of us said, it's so important to throw all our policy tools, all our intervention at preserving jobs. At the end of the day, it's about livelihoods. We need to save lives, and the vaccine will become an important measure to do that. But ultimately, protecting jobs and making sure that people have livelihoods. But the second most important point that I think the professor made early on was the need to rebuild systems of social solidarity. Many communities have not waited, they have simply acted to preserve and to protect each other in their own spheres.
Last but not least, Professor Lee.
We need a global system to produce and to disseminate global public good.
As all of you already suggested, we are having a lot of issues that we need to handle on the issue of poverty reduction, particularly at the global crisis of the pandemic. But as they say, there is a wonderful saying in China, 危机, when you have a crisis, you could also use it as an opportunity for something more innovative and for sustainable development for the future. Having said that, though, I want to thank all of you, gentlemen, for joining us online and here in the studio, and our audience sitting here in the studio. And that's all we have for today's event. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Bye for now.